What would it mean to have a rule of life here as we cross the threshold of the first quarter of the 21st century? A rule of life in the sense of a set of daily practices that you live by, grounded in some sense of transcendent value that you share with a larger community. What would it mean to have a rule of life? This is a term that I'm borrowing from the context of monastic living, the rule of life that governed the daily prayer and labor and ethical behavior of monks in the late antique and medieval Christian world. And this has been on my mind not only for personal reasons as I continue to pursue a path of theological study and religious devotion, but also in a more broadly sociological sense, because I think the conditions in which our society currently finds itself call to mind the conditions in which those monastic rules of life first emerged. We're going through a time of profound social and political and technological change and upheaval, and it's precisely in the ages of such fluctuations that it's most necessary for people to develop a way to be, a way to flourish, and to define the conditions of flourishing within a particular set of community practices, a rule of life, something that defines what life should be as the definitions of the broader socio-political order begin to break down. The rule of St. Benedict, for instance, emerged in 5th century Europe in a context of great cultural upheaval as the Roman Empire was collapsing and the Catholic Church was maintaining the vestiges of that order in the formation of organized monastic societies. And these provided not only a way to live for monks, but also an ethical paradigm for the broader culture, a sort of model of a way of life amidst the ambiguities of the shifting social and political turmoil. When you can't control what's going on around you, it's nice to be able to control how you actually live with the people that you care about who share your sphere of concern. For instance, you can't control whether or not your country invades another country arbitrarily and removes its president, but you can control how you pray, and you can control how you live. And it's easier to do so if you do so with others. In the words of psychoanalysis, the rule is strongest when the law is weakest. I'm not actually sure where that comes from in psychoanalytic theory. I heard it from my therapist in reference to my OCD. The rules we develop on a personal or community level serve the function of creating personal and relational forms of order to cope with the disorder around us. When the laws and structures and systems of power around us deteriorate or become corrupt, our superego, our inner rule-generating mechanism, becomes more active in giving us an actual way to be that gives us a sense of coherence. But these forms of order can't function for us if they're totally private. In fact, when your practices are totally private but also totally binding, that's precisely when you don't have a rule of life but an obsessive ritual neurosis. And this is why there's a relation between religion and obsession. We are social creatures, and we can't arrive at meaningful, sustainable practices simply for ourselves, but in community. This is one of the crucial observations of the philosopher and sociologist Alasdair MacIntyre, whose book After Virtue in the 1980s examined the crisis of morality and culture during the postmodern era, an era defined by the breakdown of shared practices and cultural definitions. At the end of that book, he noted that the world was waiting for another Benedict, waiting for another figure who could give us a rule of life, something to shape our values and practices as a human collective in order to reacquire a shared meaning. Who then will be our next Benedict, and will that Benedict come from an explicitly religious or even Christian or Catholic context? This is related to the observations I've recently been making about the rise of religion, and especially traditional and even Catholic religion, among young people. I recently got a piece published about this in Plough Quarterly, and you can check it out, you can read it, where I examine the relation of this rise in interest to the dynamics of digital media. It's about the role of digital discourse in converting young people to traditionalist forms of religion. This renewed interest in religion can be seen as an attempt to reacquire a rule of life, a way to be grounded in something transcendent as everything around us moves into a state of increasing flux. While there's something very beautiful about it, the problem with this digital revival of traditionalism is rooted in the nature of the digital itself. The original context in which the monastic way of living, the rule of life, operated was local and communal, embodied in in-person community settings. And it's the nature of the digital to disrupt those local relations. One of Alasdair MacIntyre's key points about practices of virtue and about morality itself is that clearly defined moral boundaries require clearly defined communities. And it's precisely these clearly defined communities that are broken down in the digital era, so that we're not actually experiencing reality at the same time and in the same way. And if we're not experiencing a shared reality, it's difficult to practice a shared morality or a shared rule of life. For the digital tools that many people are being saved on may be precisely the things that a religious rule of life should save us from. We're in a situation where the very tools that are supposed to make our life easier actually make it almost impossible to live, at least for me. We are so menaced by our own means that it becomes impossible to access the ends. It's striking, for instance, that critics of the current technocratic paradigm often refer to it as techno-feudalism, because the rule of life that first emerged in the Christian monastic context came at the advent of the feudal age. But as always, I'm skeptical of an excess of skepticism, because I do think it's possible to create a synthesis, one in which we can use these tools of communication to actually develop and share rules of life that we apply in our local community context, to develop and to discourse about, even through this medium, an eco-technological rule of life. We can think of this in specifically religious terms, and perhaps that's indeed necessary because we have to ground our shared practices in some set of shared transcendent language or recognition of the divine. But one of Alistair MacIntyre's main points in After Virtue is that contrary to the modern assumption that religion or other value systems begin with belief or with assent to some set of transcendent propositions on the basis of which we arrive at our practices, it's actually the other way around. The practices themselves are what form the basis of our beliefs. Religion is first and foremost not about what we profess, but what we actually do. How do we want to live? How can we articulate how we want to live? How do we seize the momentum of this moment in which there's a collective desire to reclaim shared forms of meaning and apply it to actual transformations of our lived behavior? My friend Colin Pugh calls this the molecular post-secular, this moment that calls for a shift towards small communities grounded in traditional faith and a contemplative re-engagement with matter itself. Thus, we might consider, what would go into a good rule of life for the current age? What are those things that you feel called to do that you consistently fail to do? And what are those things you consistently do that you usually don't have the power to not do? Rules like read at least one chapter of a physical book a day. Rules like meditate at least 15 minutes a day. Rules like don't get lost in an endless scroll of doom and masturbation. Rules like don't compose with AI if you can compose it for yourself. Automation, distraction, and pornography are categories that represent precisely the things that these rules of life need most urgently to address, because they're things that as we technologically accelerate, they become almost impossible to refuse, because our technologies are designed to make them increasingly irresistible. And they are indeed irresistible if we don't have shared practices for addressing them. And you can use some kind of app to prevent you from using those same apps, but ultimately that's not creating a holistic change in your way of life. It doesn't get to the root of the problem by actually changing the culture from the basis of which we engage reality and engage these technologies in the first place. But it's not only about prohibitions, it's also about positive practices. My own daily practice here at Divinity School has been morning and evening prayer, which actually has its roots in the same monastic rule of life that I've been discussing here, being 2 sections of the 7 daily monastic prayers called the Liturgy of the Hours. And so in addition to using this medium as a way to instigate rules of prohibition, I'm interested in using this medium as a way to develop shared prayer practices, which if you're interested in, you can get in touch with me. Whether or not you're interested in engaging it from a religious perspective, the thing that a practical rule of life for this moment would have in common with its medieval religious model is that the rule of life is all about what gets you deeper in touch with reality, with the ultimate reality, with the mystery of being here. And the measure of the value of the things that we engage with over the course of the day is proportionate to whether it gets us in touch with that mystery. The defining call of this moment is whether we can find a way to live that actually feels right as our very life is reshaped by the things that we've made to make it ostensibly easier. Unless we collectively rediscover some shared practice, some rule of life, we'll always feel like we're waiting for some threshold to pass, waiting for life to begin, waiting for life to renew itself. The new year has begun, but it's not really the transition we think it is unless we renew ourselves. And I think this is the main frontier of that renewal. As you can see, I'm very eager to enter into dialogue about these things. I'm eager for suggestions about how this could go. We could have a meeting about it, you could send me a message about it, we could have a conversation about it, and we can actually develop some collective commitments. So hit me up if you'd like to talk about this, or if you'd like to read an extended exploration of the phenomenon of digital traditionalism in the magazine Plow.